Last week, we ended our discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 25 with some laws that revolve around God's principle of fundamental fairness among one another. Those laws were given in the context of a wife who intervened in a fight that her husband was having with another man in order to help him win. She grabbed the genitals of her husband's opponent, and this got rolled into a law about not having two different sets of weights and measures used with the obvious intent to cheat people. Immediately following those two are the law we're going to begin discussing today, the law of Deuteronomy 25:17. And this law tells Israel to always remember that their arch enemy is the Amalekites. And that when the time is right, Israel is to wipe out that wicked nation. Let's reread a small section of Deuteronomy chapter 25 to begin today. We're going to start at verse 17 and just read it to the end, which is just a very few verses. Page 225 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. Remember what Amalek did to you on the road as you were coming out of Egypt. How he met you by the road. He attacked the road. He attacked those in the rear. Those who were exhausted. Those who were straggling behind when you were tired and weary. He did not fear God. Therefore, when Adonai your God has given you rest from all your surrounding enemies in the land Adonai your God is giving you as your inheritance to possess, you are to blot out all memory of Amalek from under heaven. Don't forget. Think God's serious about that one? Who are the Amalekites that Jehovah wants Israel to never forget, to eventually destroy? Well, if it weren't for the Lord choosing to put them front and center as the archetypal enemy of Israel, they were actually a rather unremarkable people about which very little is known. Genesis tells us that the person of Amalek was a grandson of Esau. I remember Esau was the patriarch Jacob's twin brother. Amalek's father was Esau's son Eliphaz. So Amalek was a grandson of Esau. Amalek was related to Israel. But because with the twins Jacob and Esau we had met a fork in the road, with Jacob continuing the line of the Hebrews, but not his twin brother Esau, that automatically means that Esau's grandson Amalek, and thus the Amalekites, those who came from him, were Gentiles. The people that Amalek spawned and grew into a nation were especially wicked in God's eyes. In fact, I contend that they are presented in the Bible as a type, as a pattern, perhaps the epitome of an enemy of Israel. Now notice in these verses that God says Israel is never to forget what Amalek did to them. That Amalek attacked Israel as they were struggling to escape the grip of Pharaoh in their journey to the promised land. Amalek didn't seem to have any known rational reason to hate and attack Israel. What could that have possibly have been? I mean, as Israel had done nothing to them that's recorded in the Bible or any other known historical narrative. Amalek hated them, so far as we know, simply because they existed. They behaved as a coward. They behaved without honor, as their method was to attack at the rear of the miles-long column of Israelites where the weak and the elderly struggled to keep up. In other words, what they did, remember what we just finished studying, was fundamentally unfair. And as you recall, fundamental fairness has been the issue of the last several verses of Deuteronomy chapter 25. Now, it would be a long time before God would finally direct Israel to bring about the annihilation of the nation of Amalek. It was King Saul, about 250 years or so after the time of Moses, who was given the direct order by God to go and attack Amalek and begin this process of ridding them from the world. Let's take the time to read the story of King Shaul and his battle with Amalek, because it ties together a couple of important principles that we've discussed in the past. Open your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 15. 1 Samuel chapter 15. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, we begin on page 313. 1 Samuel chapter 15. Samuel, said to Shaul, Saul, Adonai sent me to anoint you king over his people, over Israel. Now listen to what Adonai has to say. Here's what Adonai Sevaot says. I remember what Amalek did to Israel, how they fought against Israel when they were coming up from Egypt. Now, go and attack Amalek. Completely destroy everything they have. Don't spare them. Kill the women and men and women, children and babies, cows and sheep, camels and donkeys. Saul summoned the people and reviewed them in Telaim. 200,000 foot soldiers, with another 10,000 men from Judah. Shaul arrived at the city of Amalek and lay there in wait in the valley. Shaul said to the Kenites, Go away, withdraw, leave your homes there with the Amalekites. Otherwise I might destroy you along with them, even though you were kind to all the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt. So the Kenites went away from among the Amalekites. Then Saul attacked Amalek, starting at Havilah and continuing towards Shur at the border of Egypt. He took Agag, the king of Amalek, alive, but he completely destroyed the people, putting them to the sword. However, Shaul and the people spared Agag, along with the best of the sheep and the cattle, even the second best, also the lambs, everything that was good. They weren't inclined to destroy these things. But everything that was worthless or weak, they destroyed. Then the word of Adonai came to Samuel. I regret setting up Saul as king, because he has turned back from following me and he hasn't obeyed my orders. This made Shmuel very sad, so that he cried to Adonai all night. And Shmuel got up early in the morning to meet Shaul. However, Shmuel was told, Shaul came to Carmel to set up a monument for himself there. But now he's left and he's on his way down to Gilgal. Samuel went to Saul. Saul said to him, May Adonai bless you. I have done what Adonai ordered. But Shmuel answered, If so, why do I hear sheep bleating, cows mooing? Shaul said, Well, they brought them from the Amalekites because the people spared the best of the sheep and the cattle to sacrifice to Adonai your God. But we completely destroyed the rest. Then Samuel said to Shaul, Stop. I'm going to tell you what Adonai said to me last night. He said, Speak. Samuel then said, You may be small in your own sight, but you're the head of the tribes of Israel. Adonai anointed you king over Israel. Now Adonai sent you on a mission. And he told you, Go and completely destroy Amalek, those sinners. Keep making war on them until they've been exterminated. Why did you seize the spoil instead of paying attention to what Adonai said? From Adonai's viewpoint, you've done an evil thing. Saul said to Shmuel, I did too pay attention to what Adonai said. I carried out the mission on which Adonai sent me. I brought back Agag, the king of Amalek. I completely destroyed Amalek, but the people took some of the spoil. The best of the sheep and the cattle set aside for destruction to satisfy Adonai your God in Gilgal. Shmuel said, Does Adonai take as much pleasure in burnt offerings and in sacrifices as in obeying what Adonai says? Surely obeying is better than sacrifice, heeding orders than the fat of rams. For rebellion, it's like the sin of sorcery. Stubbornness is like the crime of idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of Adonai, he too has rejected you as king. Saul said to Samuel, I have sinned. I violated the order of Adonai and your words too, because I was afraid of the people, and I listened to what they said. Now please pardon my sin. Come back with me so that I can worship Adonai. But Shmuel said to Shaul, I will not go back with you, because you have rejected the word of Adonai, and Adonai has rejected you as king over Israel. As Shmuel was turning around to leave, he took hold of the hem of his cloak, and it tore. And Samuel said to him, Adonai has torn the kingdom of Israel away from you today. He's given it to a fellow countryman of yours who is better than you. Moreover, the Eternal One of Israel will not lie. He won't change his mind because he isn't a mere human being subject to changing his mind. And then Saul said, I have sinned. But in spite of that, please show me respect now before the leaders of my people and before Israel by coming back with me so that I can worship Adonai, your God. So Samuel followed Saul back, and Saul worshipped Adonai. And then Samuel said, bring Agag, the king of Amalek, here to me. Agag came to him in chains and said, without doubt, mine will be a bitter death. Shmuel said, just as your sword has left women childless, so will your mother be left childless among women. Then Shmuel cut Agag in pieces before Adonai in Gilgal. Samuel returned to Ramah. Saul went up to his house in Givat Shul. Never again did Samuel see Saul until the day he died. But Samuel grieved over Saul, and Adonai regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. That's pretty powerful stuff. In a nutshell, God orders King Saul to kill everyone and everything associated with Amalek. And Saul immediately summons several thousand troops. They set up an ambush, and they largely succeed in their efforts. Before Israel attacks, however, they have a parley with some people identified as the Kenites. And they warn them to leave the area, otherwise they could become collateral damage. And as was customary in battles of this era, the king of Amalek, Agag, was captured by Saul, and his life was spared. The healthy animals that belonged to the Amalekites were taken as spoils of war by the Israelites. This act angered God to such a degree that he openly stated how much he'd regretted making Saul the king of Israel. Well, the prophet and former judge, Samuel, Shmuel in Hebrew, intervened, and he told Saul that he had disobeyed God and would now pay the price for it by losing the legitimacy of his throne. Saul argued back. No, Samuel, you're mistaken. He had done what Adonai had asked of him to annihilate the Amalekites. But in the end, he admits he sinned against God, even though in his mind it was more technicality than anything significant. Samuel orders that King Agag be brought to him, whereupon he executes Agag and cuts him up into pieces. This would be the last time that Samuel ever saw Saul, the man he had earlier personally anointed to be the first king of Israel. Then in verse 23 of this chapter, the Lord compares, talking about 1 Samuel 15, the Lord compares the sin of King Saul with the sins of sorcery and idolatry. And he says that because Saul has done this evil, that God now rejects Saul. Now it's important to remember that of the few sins and crimes that automatically call for the death sentence, meaning there is no means of atonement provided for in the law of Moses, two of those are, you guessed it, sorcery and idolatry. God is through with King Saul. Now he's going to separate himself for him. That is the ultimate death sentence. See, here's the thing. What exactly did Saul do that was so egregious that he deserves such a harsh judgment? Now, essentially the reason for Jehovah's severity is all wrapped up in the answer to this question. Who ordered the war against Amalek? Answer, God, Jehovah. Therefore, this constitutes formal, God-ordained holy war. Only the divine can order holy war. Men who engage in battle in the name of God, like the Crusaders, are not engaged in holy war despite their claims. When we fight a war that God has not directly and unequivocally ordered, it may well be the necessary and the right thing to do. And God may even be on our side, so to speak. But that's not the definition of holy war. There have been no holy wars since the close of the Scriptures, at least so far as we know. There will be no holy wars until Messiah returns to lead the next holy war that we typically dub as the Battle of Armageddon. That the Lord has aided Israel at times in their several wars since returning to the Holy Land doesn't mean that Israel was fighting a holy war. Our current fight to defend ourselves against Islam, just as Israel's fight to defend their nation, while completely justified, is not holy war. I want you to see this. In holy war, the law of harem comes into play, whereby the spoils of war belong exclusively to the Lord, not to the men who capture them in battle. Since God is spirit, he has neither need for captured cattle or human slaves or gold or silver or the cities of enemies. He has no use for them. None. Therefore, according to the rules of holy war that we studied in depth some time back, all the spoils of holy war are to be handed over to God, unless he specifies otherwise, some exceptions on a case-by-case basis. These spoils are by their very nature then God's holy property. Under normal circumstances, such as the regular offering of Levitical sacrifices, the items designated as God's holy property are turned over to the priesthood for disposition, and most of the stuff, grain and fruit and wine and meat, is divided up among the priests and Levite laborers as their God-authorized means of support. A substantially smaller portion of the plants and animals are just completely burned up on the brazen altar. But in holy war, the items are generally not turned over to the priests for their distribution and use. Rather, those spoils are to be destroyed, burned up. They are returned to their elements as a symbolic way of giving them back to Jehovah. This also, as difficult as it is for us to take, goes for the captured people. God ordains what's to be done with them. In some cases, the men are to be executed, and the women and the children to be spared and added to Israel as servants. And invariably, after a few generations, they're just generally assimilated as citizens. At other times, as with Amalek, all the people are to be executed. Men, women, children, infants. Now, King Saul, being the weak and selfish king that he was, paid no attention to the Lord's holy war laws. He decided he'd do things a little bit God's way and kind of a little bit his way. So while he did follow God's commandment to attack Amalek, and it appears that as of this time, Amalek was not a particularly threatening problem for Israel and for Saul, and Shaul did execute all the people, he did not kill the king of Amalek. And in addition, he also took for himself, and he allowed some of the Israelites to take for themselves some of the spoils of war. Well, this was a direct affront upon God's holiness, as King Saul and those Israelites had helped themselves to God's holy property. This affront was so serious that God's prophet, Samuel, completely and permanently separated himself from King Saul. This was fully appropriate because what use was there, think about this, what use was there for a prophet of God to give God's word to a man whom is now separated, cut off from God? There's no more word to give him. No more need for a prophet for that king. Now, before we get back to Deuteronomy, I would like to mention a couple more things. Often in the Bible, we'll see statements that use the word all. Or we'll see statements that seem to indicate finality or full inclusion, or maybe even full exclusion, for that matter. Almost always, those are general statements. It would be like our getting bilked in some financial scheme and lamenting, oh, we've lost all our money. Well, we may be terribly damaged and indeed our wealth greatly diminished, but we've not lost 100.00% of our money, never again to have any money. That's not what it means. So in our story of the Amalekites, where it says that Saul completely destroyed the people, the Amalekites, that doesn't in any way mean that every last Amalekite was killed. In fact, it next fell to King David to again deal with the Amalekites, and he destroyed them until there was almost nothing left. Centuries later, King Hezekiah would order 500 men from the tribe of Simeon to go to Mount Seir, which is in the territory of Edom, to finally and permanently eradicate this remnant of Amalek. Now, the reason I went to this length to talk about Amalek is because of what I told you at the outset. Amalek was certainly real. The stories about them true, but they also represent a type. And the type that Amalek represents doesn't only pertain to biblical times. When we dust off the history books and we look a little closer, we see that Amalek is also symbolic of the spirit of the Antichrist and of Satan, the great evil one. Satan is the ultimate enemy of Israel and of mankind and of God. If you want to understand what God's attitude is towards Satan, what our attitude is to be towards Satan and his followers, study the story of Amalek. God is in the process of total eradication of Satan, his followers, everything that Satan possesses. Why do you think the earth is going to be burned up? Who possesses this earth? Satan. And he will do it in the pattern of his genocide upon Amalek. Now let's recall something we discussed a few weeks ago. There is this notion, it's a false notion, among many in the modern church that Jesus has revised the face, nature, and character of God away from this bloodthirsty Old Testament God who judges and destroys his enemies into this New Testament God who is a pacifist, who demands nothing of his followers, who creates no rules, who has no boundaries, and that winks at sin and wouldn't harm a fly. So great is his mercy, so much does he love everyone and everything. The concept is that Jehovah has forsaken his attributes of wrath and justice and now is 100% love and forgiveness. He is the ultimate genie in the bottle who exists only for our benefit. His New Testament motto is, no harm, no foul. And one of the primary sayings of Yeshua that's used to defend this modern proposition is, we're to love our enemies and not to hate them. I accept this instruction completely, but you have to understand, there is a night and day difference between us loving our enemies versus our loving God's enemies. Just as there exists justifiable and rational human war versus God-ordained holy war, so there is not necessarily a connection between our personal enemies, meaning like people who've harmed us or offended us as our neighbors, versus those who God has declared are His eternal enemies, enemies of the kingdom of God. We indeed are to love and not hate that person who has perhaps defrauded us, slandered us, perhaps even tried to kill us, Christian or not. But we're not to love and accept those whom God has explicitly identified as marked for destruction, because they are His eternal enemies who oppose His kingdom. Amalek was one of God's enemies. Satan, his followers, there are others. Notice how the instruction of Deuteronomy 25:17 is to at all times remember what Amalek did to Israel, how God hates them, meaning, in biblical terms, how God rejects them, and how His plan is to use Israel as His divine instrument of final destruction upon Amalek. The modern day believers of the God of Israel are equally to remember Amalek, the nation and the people of Satan, and to be prepared for holy war against them when it starts. That holy war is not far off, and we better be well into our preparation for it. It will begin when God sends Messiah Yeshua back to be that divine warrior leader against Satan and all of his followers. But while long ago the preparation for Israel was spears and bows and swords, for us it is trust in Yeshua as our Savior and in the Word of God as God's will for all men. Notice also that while Israel was to be separate as possible from Amalek and was to have nothing to do with Amalek and was to defend themselves at all times from Amalek, that a holy war against Amalek was not to be attempted any old time Israel was feeling its oats. If Israel suddenly had some religious fervor grip them, and the leaders got together and decided now they're strong enough to attack Amalek, that doesn't make it holy war. Let's move on to Deuteronomy chapter 26. Now, before we read that chapter, I'd like to introduce it by saying that it begins a 4-chapter section that revolves around the blessings and the curses contained in the law of Moses. We ended chapter 25, where the subject was essentially fundamental fairness, or its opposite, fundamental unfairness. And in this 4-chapter section of Deuteronomy that begins with chapter 26, the subject of true religion will be briefly summarized and examples will be given. That's what we all need to know. What does the Lord see as true religion? And we should all etch this divine statement into our memories. Because at the end of the section, often forgotten admonition of God is that this commandment that I command you today is not too hard for you. There is also a warning of future disasters for Israel if they fail to follow the terms of the covenant of Moses. And we're going to see some covenant renewal ceremonies to ensure that people understand that the Mosaic covenant stands forever. It didn't end when they crossed the Jordan into the promised land. But there's one more aspect of this section that's also truly fascinating. It's stated in the words of the chapter we'll get to in a few weeks, chapter 29, verse 28. That aspect is in the form of a riddle, a mystery about Israel's duty to obey the Torah. It says this. This is really interesting. The secret things belong to Jehovah our God, and the revealed things to us and to all our children forever. We are to do all the words of this Torah. I can do no better than to quote the eminent scholar C.J. Labuschagne in this regard. The plain meaning of this text of Deuteronomy refers to its immediate context, which speaks of a national disaster for Israel as a consequence of disobedience to Jehovah's commandments. But at the same time, those words have another message. The concealed things, the esoteric knowledge with regard to the written text of the law, the sacred numerical structures, all these are for the sacred benefit of God to His glory. But the text of the law, in its straight, plain language, is for the benefit of the people. What we have is a coded message to the ordinary people, the uninitiated, who do not know the hidden intricacies of the text, so that they would obey the law in its plain meaning. You see, the content of the revealed truth, meaning that part of the Torah that all men can understand, we don't have to be scholars, we can read, is what is written as part of Moses' sermon, and is contained within the central core of the law. It's those laws and commandments presented to us in plain language. Deuteronomy chapters 12 to 26. But what we find in chapters 26 through 30, these begin to delve into the realm of those deeper mysteries. Those deeper mysteries that only those who know and love and diligently seek the God of Israel can even hope to comprehend. So, let's read Deuteronomy chapter 26. Open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 26. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it's page 225. When you have come to take possession, when you have come to the land of Adonai your God is giving you as your inheritance, taken possession of it and settled there, you are to take the first fruits of all the crops the ground yields, which you will harvest from your land that Adonai your God is giving you, and then put them in a basket and go to the place where Adonai your God will choose to have His name live. You will approach the priest holding office at that time and say to him, "Today I declare to Adonai your God that I have come to the land Adonai swore to our ancestors that He would give us." The priest will take the basket from your hand and put it down in front of the altar of Adonai your God. Then in the presence of Adonai your God, you are to say, "My ancestor was a nomad from Aram. He went down into Egypt, few in number, and stayed. There he became a great, strong, populous nation. But the Egyptians treated us badly. They oppressed us and imposed harsh slavery upon us. So we cried out to Adonai, the God of our ancestors, and Adonai heard us, and He saw our misery, our toil, our oppression. And Adonai brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand, an outstretched arm, with great terror, and with signs and wonders. Now He has brought us to this place. given us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Therefore, as you see, I have now brought the first fruits of the land which you, Adonai, have given to me. You are then to put the basket down before Adonai your God, prostrate yourself before Adonai your God, and take joy in all the good that Adonai your God has given you, your household, the Levites, and the foreigner living with you. And after you've separated a tenth of the crops yielded in the third year, the year of separating a tenth, and you've given it to the Levites, the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, so that they can have enough food to satisfy them while staying with you, you are to say in the presence of Adonai your God, I have rid my house of the things set aside for God, and I've given them to the Levites, the foreigner, the orphan, and the widow, in keeping with every one of the commandments you gave me. I haven't disobeyed any of your mitzvot, your commandments, or forgotten them. I haven't eaten any of this food when mourning. I haven't put any of it aside when unclean, nor have I given any of it for the dead. I have listened to what Adonai my God has said. I have done everything you ordered me to do. Look out from your holy dwelling place, from heaven. Bless your people Israel and the land you gave us as you swore to our ancestors, a land flowing with milk and honey. Today, Adonai your God orders you to obey these laws and rulings. Therefore, you are to observe and obey them with all of your heart and all of your being. You are agreeing today that Adonai is your God, that you will follow his ways, observe his laws, commandments, and rulings, and do what he says. In turn, Adonai is agreeing today that you are his own unique treasure, as he promised you, that you are to observe all of his commandments, that he will raise you high above all the nations he's made in praise, reputation, and glory, and that, as he said, you will be a holy people for Adonai your God. One of the more interesting revelations of this chapter is that it is here and here alone in the entire Torah do we find some precisely prescribed declarations that each lay worshiper is to recite while doing the rituals of bringing their first fruits to the tabernacle. In essence, these declarations are God-designed form prayer for the ordinary Israelites. In that sense, this prayer is very similar in nature to the New Testament Lord's Prayer. While the priests often have form prayers as part of their ritual liturgy, we really don't find much in the way of form prayers in the Bible that are designed for the average person to recite. This law about bringing the first fruits to the tabernacle and later on to the temple could not be performed out in the wilderness. It was a practical matter. Only after the Israelites had conquered and settled the land of Canaan could this be observed when the tribes had fields and orchards to harvest. It is interesting to me that one of the instructions for the Hebrew farmer is that he is to place the portion of his harvest that he'll bring to present to God into a basket. It seems like an awfully trivial detail until we realize that up to this point in Israel's history, where we are now in Deuteronomy, Israel knows very little about farming. They were historically a shepherding people. They raised animals. In Egypt, some were likely engaged in agriculture, but the larger portion were shepherds. They were construction workers. Therefore, while first fruit ceremonies were known to some Middle Eastern cultures, they probably weren't very well known to the Israelites. Details had to be given to these future farmers. Now, by now, our studies have introduced us to two so-called first fruits ceremonies. The one which in Hebrew is called Bichrim, in association with the spring festivals of Passover and unleavened bread. Then another summer festival of first fruits that's called Shavuot, or Christians call it Pentecost. There is actually a third first fruits celebration that is held in conjunction with the fall festival season called Sukkot, or the Feast of Tabernacles. This last one is more technically known as the final ingathering, meaning it marks the end of the harvesting season as winter nears. Now, each of these three festivals that dealt with first fruits was connected to pilgrimage festivals. Of the 7 total biblical feasts, 3 of them required that each worshiper, generally meaning the males, journey to the location of the tabernacle with his offering of first fruits. That is the meaning of the statement in verse 3 that ends with the words, "Go to the place where the Lord your God will choose to establish his name." That place would move a few times after Israel first conquered Canaan, with Shiloh being the most permanent location for the tent. And in time, Israel would establish several competing sites. And eventually, by the time of David and then his son Solomon, it would become Jerusalem, where the temple was finally constructed. At each of these 3 times per year, journeys to the tabernacle of the worshippers to lay his basket of produce, or rather hand off his basket of produce to the priest, who will then officiate and perform the ceremony. And upon turning his sacrifice of first fruits over to the priest, the lay person is then to declare the following words: "I acknowledge that this day before the Lord your God that I have entered into the land that the Lord swore to our fathers to assign us." Now, the meaning of that declaration is straightforward, but it's also monumental. It is the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant. It is saying, God, we have fulfilled it. The land that was promised by God to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob so long ago has been given. It's finished. It was not another land. It was this land. It would not happen in another time. It was now. The connection with the giving of the first fruits of the field is that without the land they now possess, there's no first fruits to give. Now, church, I want you to hear me. It grieves my heart to hear so many denominational leaders actually question why it is that the Jews necessarily have to be back in Israel. Why can't they be someplace else? And this is an issue because the Jewish presence there supposedly has displaced these Palestinians. Well, while this is not the only place in the Bible that unequivocally states God intended to give Canaan exclusively to Israel, this event actually did occur. And God even required the Israelites to acknowledge out loud this fact in a prayerful declaration. It's noteworthy that the declaration is, "I have entered the land of Canaan." Now that might have seemed more appropriate of a declaration for the first generation of the Israelites, those who fought beside Joshua. But the Lord intends that every generation of Hebrew identify him and herself with the land as though they were the first ones there. The Mishnah states regarding the Passover observances that in every generation, one must view oneself as if you personally came out of Egypt. This is the source of that principle. Well, this concludes the first part of the first fruit ceremony. Next, after the priest has taken the basket, he sets it before the altar. The Hebrew farmer is now required to make another declaration. And what makes it interesting is that it essentially is a brief review of the history of Israel. The worshiper acknowledges a number of things in this second prayerful declaration. First, that Israel began as nothing special. My father was a nomad from Aram. The precise meaning of this has been haggled over a bit, but the underlying concept's pretty simple. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all identified more with the homeland of their ancestor, TORAH. That's Abraham's father, than the place where they wandered to, Canaan, before they then relocated to Egypt. One of the names for the region where Abraham came from is Aram, alongside the river. So this is quite correct to identify the patriarchs as Aramaeans. So some Bible versions will translate this as a fugitive from Syria, because Damascus, Syria, eventually became the stronghold for the Aramaeans, not too long after the time after the patriarchs. All that said, the thing is that each Israelite declares their personal association to the patriarchs, and the patriarchs were originally from Aram. Now, next it is acknowledged that being very small in number, Jacob's clan, in no way big enough to be seen as a people or as a nation, went down into Egypt, where they did become a large nation. Third, the condition of their stay in Egypt is now stated. It was under harsh oppression that they existed. Fourth, it was from this condition of hard labor and slavery that the Lord rescued Israel, and he did it in a miraculous and supernatural way. Fifth, God moved Israel from a place where they were landless and without hope to the land he had set aside for his people as promised to the patriarchs, where they would own land and the land would produce abundantly for them. And sixth, since it is God who owns all things, since he created all things, it's only logical that things that grow from the soil of the promised land should be seen as God's property. So a portion of what grows, the first and the best, is offered back to Jehovah in thanksgiving. Hidden in all this is that Israel denies the Canaanites' claim that Baal is the ruling god over the land. It is Jehovah that is supreme. He is behind all the wonders that have happened to Israel. Now, another interesting note is that biblically and historically, right up to this day, by the way, Jews see things within the context of the nation and the people of the Jews collectively, rather than as individuals. The scriptures bear out this view of collective identification as more important to them than individuality. Therefore, priests perform the rituals on behalf of Israel, and the feasts are for Israel to do corporately. There are only a few places in the Torah where the individual is highlighted. And it is this particular one that draws my attention because it's all about redemption. Each Israelite must acknowledge his own personal identification with the God of Israel and the redemption that Jehovah has given to him or her as an individual. The first fruit ceremonies are very personal in tone and in purpose. The ceremony then concludes with a joyous feast. A festive meal is eaten near the entry to the sanctuary, and this is required of the worshiper. And since the Levites were busy tending to the matters of the tabernacle, they generally weren't able to farm. So the Levites were to be invited to share in this festive meal provided by the hundreds of thousands of worshipers who did farm, and they came to celebrate. Even the Ger, the foreigners, were to be invited to participate because it helps Israel to remember these uncomfortable circumstances of being a foreigner in a land not their own. Therefore, they are to have mercy and compassion on foreigners because the Lord does. I think we'll end it here today, and we'll start again at verse 12 next week. Please rise.
예수와 예수와